Divisions in America are now more rampant than ever. Differences, oppositions, and views of the two political parties are more radical. Patience and tolerance of the beliefs of the opposing side is wearing thin. Donald Trump's campaign is dependent on divide, radical opposition, racism, violence, guns, lies, closing borders, and expelling immigrants. Now polls show he is ahead of both Biden and Harris if he runs in 2024. Could Donald Trump spell the end of the Union of the United States? Or will Republicans seriously try to secede from the Union if Biden is reelected?
Divided we stand, together we fall.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to We the People. I'm your host, Daniel Arya, and in this episode, we'll speak about the divide in the United States. What will happen if Donald Trump is reelected to the high office? Are Americans becoming increasingly intolerable of each other and opposing beliefs? Will there be more turmoil and possibly another civil war? As usual, we're pleased to have our two guests on our show, Paul DeRienzo, who is a news director at WBAI radio station, and James Carey, who is an activist and political commentator. Please stay with us.
A new poll conducted by Redfield and Wilton Strategies revealed that Donald Trump took a large lead over President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for the 2024 presidential race. 44% of respondents said they'd vote for Trump if he's a candidate in the 2024 presidential election, while 39% said they'd vote for Biden. And if the vote would be between Trump and Harris, 45% of respondents said they'd vote for Trump and 36% for Harris. These results show Trump's advance since early November, where Trump and Biden were tied at 42%.
Move.
Armed militias reportedly on the rise, driven by xenophobia and racism, but also by fear of government itself.
I think what the government gives, the government can take away.
Even for those not driven to pick up arms, the anger seems palpable in America.
By show of hands, how many of you would say that you're mad as hell about all the stuff that's going on? It's almost all of you.
The examples of regular citizens lashing out at each other fill our news feeds every day.
That's not how we drive in America. Trump's deporting your illegal cousins today.
Real examples of violence motivated by hate.
Last year, there were secession books published from both sides of the U.S. political spectrum. From the right, George Mason University's F.H. Buckley published American Secession, arguing that, quote, U.S. is ripe for secession, and there's much to be said for an American breakup. From the left, the Nation's Richard Kreitner wrote, Break it up, contending that we must finally finish the work of Reconstruction or give up on the Union entirely. So what are the roots of divide today in the country?
Well, I mean, historically, we have quite a bit. We have North and South. Obviously, these were different economies, but I think now that split you see is between urban areas being taken over by a liberal professional class. You have a lot more white-collar, educated workers, middle-class children moving into the cities. And outside of those cities are, say, people in manufacturing or in dead zones, like I am around Detroit, which is, formerly a manufacturing hub, but there's not much here. There's an Amazon fulfillment center, of course. But the division now is between these sort of professional class people who live in the city and who can afford to live in these increasingly expensive cities and are willing, they're the very diehard liberals. They are the people who support all the mandates and, they support every Democratic politician. They always have a Democrat mayor. But outside of the cities, it's basically there is no solution for the people left outside of them because the Democratic Party is aiming at those people in the cities. And then outside of the cities, that you have the GOP, the Republicans, who are, again, leading them down a path that doesn't actually get anywhere.
Now, the divide in the country has been accumulated by secession efforts in schools, which have reintroduced segregation. Black students in the South are less likely to attend a majority white school today than 50 years ago, while Black and Latino students are attending schools which are more likely to be predominantly non-white and low income. Mr. DeRienzo explains some of the reasons behind the new segregation.
What happened was when they desegregated schools in 1954, which were legally segregated, a lot of white people just pulled their kids out and put them in private schools and in religious schools. Absolutely. A lot of people teach their students at home, which is legal in the United States. In most states, you can teach them. You have homeschooling. You can teach them at home. There's a fear and a running away from modernity in this country, and to going back to a time that doesn't really exist, and I don't think ever existed. MAGA, Make America Great.
Largely white and wealthy communities are breaking away from more integrated school districts to establish their own, often justifying the move as a way to maintain local control over education. Since 2000, more than 120 communities nationwide have attempted to secede from their school districts. Reports indicate that at least 47 of these communities did secede, taking with them millions of dollars in property taxes. Those secessions took place in 13 counties across the U.S., 7 of them in the South.
The schools that are actually breaking away from their districts, these are typically higher income neighborhoods, and they are genuinely they're trying to resegregate schools. They're trying to go back to before the Civil Rights Act, and they're trying to make sure that their school and their children are well taken care of, but they do not want to carry the burden of anyone else who lives around them. There's not really a sense of community in this country besides maybe around churches. So people try to make sure that the public services they get don't go to anyone they don't want them to. They think people who get them that aren't like them aren't worthy of them, and they shouldn't have the same quality. Schools now, it's a matter of if I don't want my child learning something, or if I don't want my child to think a certain way, or I don't want to around certain people, I'm going to separate into a new school district.
Now, according to an analysis recently updated and released by the Brennan Center for Justice, 19 states have passed 33 new laws this year that make it harder to vote.
Now, while at the same time, lawmakers in many states made it easier for eligible voters to cast their ballots, but these legislations do not balance the scales. States which have enacted restrictive laws tend to be the same ones in which voting is already relatively difficult, while states which have enacted expansive laws tend to have relatively more accessible voting processes. In light of this, are Americans becoming increasingly intolerable of each other and other beliefs?
Absolutely. I was just talking about that. It's a dangerous time. And the conservative, the right-wing people, the fascist-leaning people, and I mean that, are the ones who have the vast majority of the weapons in this country, in a country where a lot of, you see, the liberal side of the country has been good at controlling the governmental operations. And in so many ways, despite all you hear, they have a lot of control over the police, the courts, the laws on the liberal side. So the right-wingers who have the money and have the guns are more and more legalizing and advocating vigilantism as the answer to that.
Based on the Brennan Center report, the 33 laws enacted so far in 2021 have various impacts, including but not limited to making mail voting and early voting more difficult, imposing harsher voter ID requirements, and making faulty voter purges more likely. In other words, access to the right to vote increasingly depends on the state in which a voter happens to reside. So what is the status of political intolerance among the people and politicians?
There's not really any middle ground anymore. I don't know that there ever was, but there's not too much middle ground between either party, and it seems those of us on the outside trying to make any sensible argument has basically been left in the cold. There isn't anything anyone can agree on because none of us share any idea of what's actually wrong with the country. Everyone's reality is so fractured. Everyone believes in different things, whether it's, if you think Hillary is eating children or if you think Donald Trump is going to prison. There's these two extremes of the spectrum, and they just constantly yell at each other. And the majority of Americans who don't vote are stuck in the middle of these two crowds of people. And it's their irreconcilable differences that just leave us all in a deadlock.
On January 6, the Confederate battle flag was flown inside the capital of the United States. And that forbidden word, secession, which went viral prior to the Civil War, is now spoken on the tongues of conservatives and liberals. 52% of Trump supporters and 41% of Biden supporters are in favor of disunion. The question here is what the Civil War was about and if it still affects American politics.
The United States was born in a twin revolution. The American Revolution of the 18th century that we may know about, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the rest, that freed the country from colonial domination of England, but it did not eliminate the basic stain on the character of the country, and that was the slave trade. And the slave trade was not just limited to the United States. All the countries that were bordering the Atlantic Ocean were involved in it. And it's often I say that the United States is a bad offender, but it actually had one of the smaller numbers of slaves compared to Brazil and other countries. But I think its root of its constitution and its belief that we are better than that has led to a conflict for many, many years over the economy of slavery versus the ideals that the country was founded on. The conflict of both those values and those views have really been a big part of the problem. And the second revolution, Part B, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, in which the northern part of the United States basically invaded the formerly part of the United States, but very, very culturally different from the United States, its bordering southern states, and conquered them and forced them to renounce their slave population of 4 or 5 million people held in bondage that brought a vast, vast wealth to the country, not only a vast wealth, but maybe the slave population in the United States South, in the southern states, the Confederacy it was called back then, was possibly equal to greater than any wealth accumulation in the history of humanity. And an army, of Northerners went down there and at gunpoint, at bayonet point, stripped them of that property. And there's never been peace in the country since.
Early November this year, an anonymous caller told a Republican congressman who voted with Democrats in favor of the infrastructure bill that he and his staff should die. On Monday, Twitter added a warning label to a cartoon video shared by a different Republican congressman in which he assassinated a colleague from across the aisle. And later, a Black Lives Matter organizer threatened bloodshed if New York's mayor-elect reinstated a controversial anti-crime police unit. And also, an interview was released in which former President Donald Trump defended rioters calling for the hanging of his vice president.
The United States is divided in, it's in pretty bad shape, obviously. Clearly, the election of Trump showed that there's not a consensus on a shared project or anything like that anymore. But it is the disconnection of the politicians that makes this basically irreconcilable. There's two types of politicians now. There's the ones who are trying to convince us that the end of history Reaganomics model still works. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is someone like Trump or that ilk, who are constantly punching at problems that don't exist, blaming countries for things they don't do, instead of tackling the real problems.
From 1861 to 1865, Americans from the South or the Confederates fought a war with the Union or the North. The American Civil War was about slavery. Now, more than ever, the population and politicians of the United States are divided. Their views on each other has become more radical, and tolerance of the other side's opinions and views have thinned down. Even issues such as mask and vaccine mandates from the federal government is prompting some states to call for secession.
The extreme right wing, I don't see it as of itself happening. But I know the extreme right wing in this country wants to separate the country into racially and ethnically divergent areas. They call them the Aryan nations, parts of the country where only white people would be allowed to live. Parts of the nation that only black people would be allowed to live. Parts of the nation that only Mexican people would be allowed to live. And some of the even more extremist ones say that if you're not white, if you're not descendants of white Northern European culture, then you should be just driven out of the country. And then there's on the other hand, you're talking about the extreme right, and then there's the religious people who are like portrayed in that film series, The Handmaid's Tale, whose main thing is controlling women. So you have one, and they're different. Sometimes they overlap, right? You have people who just want to, and you could have parts of this country. There was a separation thing where they would separate white part of the country and a black part of the country. But now they're saying, the right wing, I'm seeing things said like we should just drive them out of the country entirely. You're not an American. You have no right to be here if you're not white and descendant from the Northern Europe. End of story. And we'll kill you or drive you out of the country or give you a chance to get out. Go to Canada, Mexico, just get out or else. There's definitely people who feel that way, and they're growing in power. A lot of it is, I'm not kidding, I wish I was joking, but I can show you the rhetoric. The other view, maybe the more moderate view that's out there, is that it should be more like South Africa, where the whites just have control of the army and all the other people are, live in terror of their lives and have no rights. And you see that with a lot of the white people in the conservative parts of the country, which are a lot of parts of the country, moving into gated communities, no blacks allowed.
A Trump re-election could make the empire's worst nightmares come true. Deep divisions could push the United States in becoming more of a police state, and this could all result in a civil war.
Now, with Joe Biden's approval rating falling to its lowest since his election, difficult laws being passed to dissuade voters from voting in most Republican states, the never-ending deaths from COVID-19, violence against minorities, and the dire economic situation in the country, you should expect more unrest, division, and political uncertainty in America.
Today on Power to the People, we will talk about integration and neocolonialism and how it paved the way for Barack Obama's presidency. Before we dive into neocolonialism, let's first establish what colonialism is. Colonialism in itself is about gaining control of a territory and subjecting it to the interests of the foreign power, aka the colonizer. It is an economic and thus a political form of subjugation. Neocolonialism is an evolution of colonialism. It is when a colonized nation achieves quote-unquote independence, yet this newly independent nation is still subjected to the political, social, economic, and cultural order of the former colonial system. As Kwame Nkrumah said, the essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. But in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside. In the context of America, neocolonialism was birthed post-Jim Crow as America moved towards integration. Integration itself was a containment strategy used by the United States to stop the rebellion of black revolutionary movements. It gave the illusion of inclusion as some type of liberation. But what type of sense does it make to integrate a people into the master's house as a means of gaining freedom? Integrating and joining the side of the colonialists only creates more oppressors, and we have to eradicate the colonial system for us to truly be free. The Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, says, if you imitate a people, then you are of that people. If we look at Barack Obama, America's first black president, Barack Obama's presidency strengthened neocolonialism as well as imperialism. Obama himself imitated and acted like every other president. Some people call this hope, and some people call this change. Some people call this Martin Luther King's dream. But Obama's presidency was a reign of terror onto black, brown, and indigenous peoples of the world, and must be understood as such. Neocolonialism and integration in America, they both go hand in hand. And this allowed black people to join this colonial system and then oppress our own people. We went from having all-white police forces to now having integrated forces where black cops now harass and kill their own people. If we look at the case of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, we had a black president, a black cop, black head of Department of Homeland Security, a black mayor, a black prosecutor, black everything. And what happened? He was murdered. And despite having all of these black people in positions of power, no justice was served. And we cannot expect the Euro-American court system to provide justice for the colonized. We have to get justice ourselves. And what was Obama's response? He called the people rebelling in the streets thugs. He called the people in the streets criminals. And throughout Obama's presidency, he refused to stand up for victims of police killings, nor did he stand up for victims of environmental racism. When Obama visited Flint, Michigan, he told black people that it was okay to drink the lead-infected water. When it came to economic support, he bailed out Wall Street. He bailed out the car industry, but refused to bail out the people. If we look at black home ownership under Obama, it was virtually destroyed and gentrification reached new heights. This is neocolonialism in a nutshell, and Barack Obama took neocolonialism and imperialism to new heights. This was a chess move for white supremacy. During the Bush era, massive protests against the war in Iraq erupted within the USA, and the state needed a new head of state to advance the control of the empire as well as stop the protests in the streets. We know that America itself is racist to its core, so the state, understanding this, used the black man and the facade of change as an attempt to cover up the ruthless and evil actions of the empire. Obama himself weaponized the language of the civil rights movement, giving the facade of change, when in reality, the change that took place was the strengthening of imperialism. Obama himself executed more drone strikes in his first year than George Bush did his whole presidency. Let's look at the facts. Quote, a total of 563 strikes, largely by drones, targeted Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen during Obama's 2 terms, compared to 57 strikes under Bush. Between 384 and 807 civilians was killed, and these are their own reports. These stats also don't even include the battlefields that were active. And it didn't stop there. Obama also advanced CIA drone black sites in Africa, which then expanded under Donald Trump. He also led to the expansion of the United States Africa Command, better known as AFRICOM. This serves as an imperialist force on the motherland and is responsible for orchestrating coups and interfering with the autonomy and the self-determination of African nations. During Obama's presidency, he dropped 20,000 bombs that we know of. This is terrorism, and this must be understood as genocidal. Obama himself also refused to close Guantanamo Bay and allowed for the torture of innocent Muslims to continue. As Kwame Nkrumah said, neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism, and Barack Obama perfectly illustrates that through his actions as commander-in-chief. To close out, as Imam Jamil Al-Amin said, quote, you cannot succeed in overthrowing Pharaoh by using Pharaoh's program. We have to realize that in order to stop neocolonialism, that we ourselves are our own liberators. We cannot use this colonial system to liberate ourselves. We have to destroy the colonial system in its entirety. Free the people, free the land. This is power to the people.
Well, that was our show, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Daniel Arya. Please do join us again next week for another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.